Before we begin, let us know where you're listening from. After the story, rate it from 1 to 10. Now let's start. The morning shift horn no longer pierced Paul Novak's dreams. After 22 years at the Jefferson Assembly plant, his body clock woke him at 4:30 a.m. regardless. He stared at the ceiling, his wife Teresa's breathing steady beside him, and flexed his hands. The arthritis wasn't so bad today. Small mercy. Paul slid from bed and crossed the cold linoleum to the bathroom, avoiding the floorboard that creaked. In the mirror, a 53-year-old man with steel-gray stubble and deep lines around his eyes stared back. His father had worked 43 years at Dodge, Maine. Paul had always assumed he'd match that, maybe even beat it. Job for life, his father had said when Paul got hired in '65. Nobody ever got rich working the line, but nobody starves either. That December morning in 1987 felt like any other. Snow predicted, temperatures in the 20s. The radio murmured about Reagan and Gorbachev while Paul ate toast at the kitchen table. The Detroit Free Press folded beside his coffee cup. The business section had been running ominous articles for weeks. Roger Smith, GM's chairman, had a reputation for restructuring. Everyone knew something was coming, but nobody wanted to name their fears. "You're wearing your good flannel," Teresa said, appearing in her nightgown, hair tousled from sleep. She poured coffee and sat across from him. "Meeting with the union rep today," Paul said, though they both knew it meant nothing. He'd been wearing his good clothes more often lately, as if proper appearance could ward off what was coming. "Tommy's room is ready," she said quietly. Their son had moved to Chicago 3 years earlier for college, but lately they'd been preparing for his possible return. Another thing they didn't discuss directly. Outside, Paul's Oldsmobile Cutlass, employee discount, of course, protested the cold with a whining starter. He'd bought American his entire life. His father would have considered anything else treason. The plant loomed against the winter sky, a sprawling complex of brick and steel. Paul had spent more waking hours here than in his own home. He'd memorized every oil stain on the floor, every dent in the lockers. The sound of pneumatic tools and the conveyor system formed a symphony he could interpret like a conductor, hearing the slightest variation that meant trouble. "Novak," Tina Green nodded as they passed in the hallway. She'd started 10 years after him, the first woman on their section of the line. Now she supervised the quality control team. Meetings been moved up. 9 o'clock, main conference room. The floor was different that morning. Quieter conversations. More supervisors walking around with clipboards. Men in suits who didn't belong there, their leather shoes impractical on the oil-slicked concrete. "It's happening," said Mike from the next station over. "My cousin at the Flint plant says they got the notice yesterday." Paul nodded but said nothing. He didn't want to give the fear substance by speaking it aloud. They'd survived layoffs before. The oil crisis in '73. The recession in the early '80s. Each time, Paul had enough seniority to stay. Each time, he watched younger men clean out their lockers, their faces hollow with shock. He'd felt guilty about his relief, but never questioned the system. Put in your time, keep your head down, and the company would take care of you. At precisely 9 a.m., they gathered in the conference room. Too many people for the available chairs. The plant manager, Dennis Callahan, stood at the front, flanking a man in an expensive suit Paul didn't recognize. "I'll be brief," the suit said. As part of General Motors' restructuring initiative, 11 plants across the country will be permanently closed by 1989. Jefferson Assembly is one of them. The words hit like a physical blow. Paul heard a rushing sound in his ears. Beside him, someone swore softly. He focused on his hands gripping his knees, the knuckles white. "Operations will be phased out over the next 14 months. Personnel will be offered transfers where available, buyout packages based on seniority, or standard severance." Paul barely heard the rest. 22 years of loyalty reduced to 3 clinical options on a corporate spreadsheet. In the parking lot afterward, men stood in small groups, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Nobody seemed to be returning to work, though no official dismissal had been given. "Transfer to where?" Mike was saying. "Arlington. Shreveport. My whole family's here." Paul sat in his Cutlass, hands resting on the wheel, engine off. The dashboard clock read 10:17 a.m. In a normal day, he'd have helped assemble 8 vehicles by now. He tried to calculate how many cars had passed through his hands over 22 years. Thousands upon thousands of vehicles, each one carrying his fingerprints invisibly across America. When he finally drove home, Teresa was waiting. She'd heard already. News traveled fast through the network of plant wives. "Paul," she said, just his name. Her eyes were red. "I've got seniority," he said automatically. "I'll get priority for transfers." But even as he spoke the words, something inside him rebelled. Move to Texas at 53? Start over in Oklahoma? Leave the house they'd spent decades turning into a home? The phone rang constantly that evening. Relatives, neighbors, friends from church. Paul let Teresa handle the calls. He sat in his recliner, a beer warming in his hand, watching the news. Roger Smith's face appeared, explaining the necessary restructuring for GM to remain competitive. Paul hurled the beer can at the TV. It sprayed foam across the screen, Teresa jumping in her chair beside him. "I'll clean it," he said, but didn't move. The days that followed took on a surreal quality. They still went to the plant, but actual work had all but stopped. Men wandered the floor, gathering in knots to compare buyout offers and debate options. Union representatives set up information tables. Financial advisors appeared, passing out business cards, eyes gleaming with the opportunity of commissions from severance packages. "I put in for Lansing," Mike told him over vending machine coffee. "My wife's got family there." Paul nodded, though he hadn't completed his own paperwork. Every option felt like surrender. Transfer meant uprooting their lives. Buyout meant admitting his working life was over a decade too soon. Severance was unthinkable, the option for those without enough years to matter. He believed the system was fair. Do your part, and the company would do theirs. 22 years of perfect attendance, of volunteering for overtime, of production bonuses and quality awards framed in his basement. He'd sacrificed weekends, missed baseball games and school plays, worked night shifts that left him a ghost in his own home. All because he believed in the unspoken contract between worker and company. "What about Pole Town?" Teresa asked one night, referring to the new plant GM had built after demolishing an entire Detroit neighborhood. "It's not that far. Fully automated," Paul said flatly. "Half the workers, twice the output." 3 weeks after the announcement, Paul was replacing the bathroom faucet, a job he'd postponed for months, when the doorbell rang. Teresa answered it, voices murmuring in the entryway. Then footsteps approached the bathroom door. "Paul." It was Tommy, their son, duffel bag over his shoulder, winter coat still on. "Mom said I should come straight up." Paul stood, wrench in hand, face and shirt wet from the sink. "What are you doing here? Semester doesn't end for 2 weeks." Tommy set his bag down. "I took my finals early. Figured you could use the help around here." Something in his son's expression, a mixture of concern and determination, made Paul turn away, suddenly unable to look him in the eye. "I'm managing fine," he said to the sink. That night, after Teresa went to bed, the two men sat at the kitchen table. Tommy had brought a bottle of whiskey, good stuff that a student shouldn't have been able to afford. "Professor Whitman helped me land an internship," Tommy said, pouring them each another finger. "Architecture firm in Chicago. Starts in February." Paul nodded, feeling the warm burn of the whiskey. His son had always been good with his hands, but had wanted to design buildings, not assemble cars. "When I was your age," Paul said, "having a job at GM was winning the lottery. Union card, benefits, pension." "I know, Dad. Your grandfather worked 43 years. Never missed a day." Paul twisted his glass. When he retired, they gave him a gold watch and a party. 300 people came. Tommy was quiet, waiting. Now they're closing plants by press release. 11 plants. 40,000 jobs. Just, Paul snapped his fingers. "Like they're nothing." "It's not your fault," Tommy said. Paul looked up sharply. "What? You did everything right. This isn't happening because you failed." The words struck something deep inside him. Paul had been so focused on what he'd lost, he hadn't examined the belief underneath, that if you worked hard enough, were loyal enough, sacrifice enough, you'd be rewarded. That failure meant you deserved what you got. "I've been angry at the wrong people," Paul said finally. "GM didn't owe me a job for life. But they owed us the truth. All those years, they knew what was coming. They took everything we had to give, knowing they'd discard us when it suited them." Tommy nodded, understanding beyond his years. "So what will you do?" Paul had been avoiding that question for weeks. The transfer paperwork sat unsigned in his briefcase. The buyout offer, a substantial sum that felt like blood money, had a deadline approaching. I don't know who I am without the plant, he admitted finally. 22 years, I defined myself by that job. You're my dad, Tommy said simply. Your mom's husband. You're the guy who taught me to change a tire and throw a curveball and stand up when things get hard. The first genuine smile in weeks tugged at Paul's mouth. When did you get so smart? Must have been all those lectures you gave me about responsibility. The next morning, Paul woke before his alarm again. But instead of getting up, he lay in bed, watching the snow fall outside their window. He thought about the factory that had been the center of his existence for so long. He thought about what came next. Teresa stirred beside him. You're still here, she murmured sleepily. I'm taking the buyout, he said. The words felt strange in his mouth, but right. I'm not transferring, and I'm not waiting for them to hand me the minimum severance. She propped herself up, suddenly wide awake. Are you sure? Yeah. He was surprised to find he meant it. I've got skills. I can find something. Maybe not the same money, but something. And we've got savings. She laid her head on his chest, her hand finding his. I was so worried you'd want to move to Texas or somewhere. This is our home, he said firmly. They've taken enough. The Jefferson plant closed officially on December 23, 1988, though production had dwindled for months before that. Paul drove there on the final day, parking in the vast, near-empty lot. The few remaining workers were collecting personal items, the machinery already being dismantled for shipment overseas or to more automated facilities. Mike was there, clearing out his locker. Heading to Lansing next week, he said. You? Paul shook his head. I'm staying put. Got a job starting with a commercial HVAC installer after New Year's. Less money, but it's something. They walked through the silent assembly line together, their footsteps echoing. Paul ran his hand along the station where he'd worked for so many years. The metal was cold. Doesn't seem right, Mike said. All this just going away. It was never about us, Paul replied. That was the lie we told ourselves. Outside, snow was falling again, covering the parking lot in clean white. Paul thought about his father, about the gold watch, about the world that no longer existed. In the Oldsmobile, he sat for a long moment before starting the engine. On the passenger seat lay an application for night classes at Wayne County Community College. Teresa had found the program, certification in electrical systems, building on skills he already had. He pulled out of the lot for the final time, not looking back at the darkened plant in his rearview mirror. The old life was ending, but he was still here. Still Paul Novak, still a man who knew how to build things, how to fix what was broken. Different work perhaps, but the same hands. He believed the factory defined him. Now he would have to discover who he was without it. The thought was terrifying, and he was surprised to realize, a little exhilarating too. At 54, he was starting over. Ahead, Detroit spread out under its blanket of snow, a city that had risen and fallen and would rise again. Paul turned the radio on, adjusted his grip on the wheel, and drove toward home.